the older adults that you see. Um, I'm just going to spend 1 minute on Seabury because I know we've got to move along here, but Seabury is a larger organization, but the program that I work for is the care management program. And I think it's really important because one of the goals that I suspect we share with you all is to help the people we work with maintain a high quality of life. And in that piece, what I think really bounces out at me with our kind of our program goal is that each person has unique physical, emotional, social, and financial needs. And I did want to briefly just kind of bring that to your attention. And as we get started, I wanted to bring us to the same point. And what I mean by the same point is that we all come to work with older adults because of something within our life, whether it's just the need to volunteer, whether it's a grandparent or an older person who really spoke to us. We all come from different attitudes. We all come with our cultural sensitivities to aging, the family that we were raised in. So, and there's good and bad pieces to all of this. So with that in mind, I just want you to think about these words as I pop them up onto the screen. Old, elderly, over the hill, geriatric, senior, aged, wise one, and elder. And again, part of the reason I wanted to bring these to your attention is because I do feel that we come to this from so many different perspectives. And in my own time in working with older adults, I have seen some of these words take on a positive aspect, and I've seen others take on a negative aspect, and I've seen them switch. So I really want us to kind of think about the stereotypes that are out there, whether they're negative stereotypes, that these are frail people, it's always those people who are older, or on the other side of the spectrum, are these the wise ones? Are these the ones who have the knowledge and should be respected and engaged? And I say that because I think it's important to recognize that everyone we work with is unique. They're all human, and they're all looking for that engagement. So what are some, for some reason that came up differently than it was supposed to. What are some common age-related changes? Because there are some common changes that come up. And if you do have a comment as we're going on, as Frank mentioned, please feel free to pop it into the chat bar. I will go up to the top of my screen and take a look at it. I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to present, but I do have to look for the chat on here. So I will try to do that at the end of every slide. But as we get older, there are some common age-related changes. I think the ones that we all typically think of immediately are things like hearing, not able to take in some of those tones any longer. Vision, as we get older, our vision really does start to telescope in some ways. We start losing our peripheral vision. With regard to the cognitive changes and memory loss, it might just take us a little bit longer to process what's coming through to us. We might have issues with getting something on the tip of our tongue. And again, some of these things are typical of all ages, right? We've all had that experience where we just can't think of the word no matter what we do, and we just have to relax a minute. That's all normal. But it does tend to happen a little bit more often. Most of us have heard of dementia. That's not normal. And dementia, and I do feel like I need to stop for just a moment and mention dementia, because when we're talking about dementia, this is when someone's cognitive changes or the memory loss has started impacting their daily living. So they're no longer able to compensate. And certainly people in either the pre-dementia stage or maybe even in the early dementia may be able to compensate as well. But that's not what I'm talking about here. Again, we might have some slower reaction times. You'll see that many older adults often take themselves out of driving, perhaps not driving altogether, but I know I have many people personally as well as professionally who have decided, you know what, I'm no longer driving X number of miles, or I'm no longer driving at night. Even my own mother, you know, she let my dad do all the driving. And when he passed away, she's like, no, I'm going to stay here. You come visit me. Certainly balance and coordination. We start to lose muscle mass as we get older, which does impact our balance. We may start needing some assistive device for mobility. In fact, about 60% of those 60 and older do need some sort of assistive device. Certainly, I'm talking about physical changes here, but there is the loss of relationships. Someone has mentioned just the loss of family or the loss of friends, loved ones. Our inner circle starts to decline. So when we're talking about social isolation, what are we talking about? And I think for me and for this group, what I wanted to bring in is isolation versus loneliness. Social isolation on a scientific or medical piece is very objective. It is about counting how many contacts you have in a week or in a month. So there's a very objective quality to it. Whereas loneliness is the subjective feeling of isolation. And I think it's important to just discern what the difference is, because the objective lack, the social isolation, can really give us a good indicator. But what we're also trying to address as volunteers is that subjective feeling. Because remember, I can be in a crowd of individuals and feel completely alone. And I may be in that crowd and feeling completely alone because I can no longer understand. I can no longer pick out the conversations that are going on around me. Perhaps I'm in a busy restaurant because that's where my book club is. Again, maybe pre-COVID. But now I can't pick it out anymore. So for me, hearing what you have to say, I need to be in a quiet place. I need to be where we can be one-on-one with each other. We've also been in the situation where we're completely alone, and yet we don't have any loneliness whatsoever. So that's the other reason why I feel like we need to understand both of these terms, the social isolation versus the loneliness, because it is important for us to connect to others, even if mom has always been a loner or dad never talked to anybody. But we are all human beings and we do need to be engaged. So, and someone has commented that vision loss is generally accepted with patients and supported by volunteers and others. whereas hearing loss, on the other hand, frequently irritates other people and requires extra effort on their behalf to help, which can be very tiring. Important, this is a long one, important to be aware of as hearing loss, more than vision loss, it can isolate individuals because they feel they bother. The bother they engender or the loud sounds of their hearing aids may generate. Yeah, I completely agree. I would also comment that with regard to the vision, sometimes we don't know how much people are able to see. There's no visual cue for us as volunteers that someone can't see. So that might be something that can, no pun intended, be a blind spot for many of us as well, because you can't see what the other person is seeing or not seeing. But I completely agree that hearing as well can really cause a sense of loneliness and isolation. Okay. So we talked on a little bit of this already, but really older adults with functional disabilities do start to feel like an outsider, just like the comment just said, and just as I was indicating. And again, with the hearing, the other thing, or even the vision, if people are no longer catching those visual social cues that people are giving them, or they're no longer capturing exactly what somebody has said, you either start to take yourself out of the game, or else in other cases, you're no longer invited because of that extra work. And sometimes with the hearing loss, many people, it gets named as dementia instead of the hearing loss that it actually is. So that's one of the things to think about. Also, just having to, for me, when I'm bringing an older adult out, sometimes helping them be safe by using their walker, well, that I can't use my walker because that makes me different than everybody else here. I don't want to go out if I have to feel like this. So that's where some of these functional disabilities can come in as well. And also other people just helping you in general, being more cognizant of the fact, concerned that I might trip or I might fall. And for some people that makes them very uncomfortable as well. Of course, the impact of chronic illness on social isolation, we might be seeing more doctors. So those touch points that I was talking about, we might have a medical appointment a week or more than one medical appointment a week, but there's not that engagement there. What we're also seeing with chronic illness is that oftentimes it's bi-directional. So especially when you're talking about something like heart disease, it seems in the medical journals, you'll see that there's an impact of that heart disease on social isolation and vice versa. And in some cases, it's kind of which one came first or which one is impacting. It has a much greater impact. Our health has a much greater impact on loneliness and isolation and vice versa than we've ever thought about. And just that idea of not engaging can really impact that illness. I think the impact of dementia is more obvious than that of chronic illness because you do start to see that detachment. It really is an epidemic. I'm sure that most of you have heard social isolation is worse for your health than smoking, a high-fat diet, or sugar diets. I think the statement was that it's like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So it's pretty tough. The pandemic has really put just increased this tremendously in the previous discussion about what services individuals are offering. We talked about some of this a bit, the idea that everybody has to be connected through the internet hasn't worked for individuals. What we've seen in our own practice, and again, this has been mentioned prior, that people are coming to us and we just don't understand what's happened with mom and dad, but something has happened with mom and dad. And I keep telling the family caregivers who call, it's just this isolation. It is the pandemic. It may not be COVID, but it's the pandemic and the ramifications of that. Okay. How prevalent is it? Well, about 1 in 4 community dwelling older adults are thought to be socially isolated, which is quite a number of them. And that's from the National Academy of Sciences and AARP. They determined that there's about a 50% increased risk of dementia and other medical conditions. And that's a scary thought. And again, those other medical conditions, maybe some of these other chronic illnesses such as heart disease. The link with diabetes isn't as strong, but it's still there. So some of the risk factors of social isolation include things like living alone. Perhaps this is because someone's spouse or someone's partner has passed away. It might be that they've always chosen to live alone, but again, those connections, such as the loss of family and friends, has really decreased. We talked about the chronic illness and the sensory impairments. I think this one is really important. Again, I started this with perception. I feel like perception is such a huge part of ourselves. And if I perceive that I have bad or very bad health, then it's going to impact how I react to things. So if I feel like I have, horrible heart disease, or I feel like my memory is going, then I may take myself out of the game again, and I may stop participating, or I may just feel so tired. Again, that's part of the chronic illness as well. I'm just so tired of having to organize all this, having to figure it all out. Maybe I've had the death of a loved one on top of it, or death of another prominent person in my life. And I just can't do it anymore. Caregivers and care receivers, that's also a social isolation risk factor. So one might think, well, why, if they're living in the same home, which sometimes they're not. We know frequently that there are family caregivers who live near or perhaps all the way across the country. We even have family caregivers who live out of the country. But even when you live in the same home, it can be socially isolating. The feeling that nobody else understands this, what I'm going through, my situation is different than this one. That's why it's so important for the programs that are out there, as well as the volunteers, to connect and to help normalize some of what's going on, because yes, while it's unique, there are other people going through this. And again, even as a care receiver, the person who has the chronic illness, or perhaps in many cases, dementia, they can also feel isolated. Again, when you have a caregiver and a care receiver, we're often, even the care receiver who has dementia, may be feeling what that other person is feeling. So it's important for caregivers as well to take care of themselves. A lack of education and lack of income may also be equal to the opportunities that are out there, but that is one of the social isolation factors. Transportation is one, not being able to get out, not being able to drive any longer, perhaps not being able to use public transportation if they are in DC. Maybe they're not near a transportation option. Immigrants, this one came up as well, both because they don't have the family support that might be there for the non-immigrants. There may also be a language barrier that's there. And of course, the LGBTQ community. We do have another one. Thank you for bringing up the additional risk factor. Yes, the other thing that we're seeing a lot too, or recognizing a lot, although our Medicare health insurance may not be keeping up with this yet, but it is the poor oral health and dental care. Certainly the connection between that and a chronic illness. The other piece to that is just, how do I look? If I have missing or worn teeth, they may not speak as much or laugh as much. So this person's also talking about volunteers and asking about oral health. I think certainly providers should be asking about oral health. You know, people like myself who are in care management, that would be part of our assessment. One of the things as volunteers, which depending upon the community that you are volunteering with, whether it be a faith group, whether it be a village group or another group, is understanding what our boundaries are as well. So, you know, if I'm taking somebody to the grocery store, it may not be within my realm of volunteering work to ask about somebody's dental care, but certainly I think it's important for volunteers to have information about services or know where they can send people, because that's why we providers are out there, is so that volunteers and community organizations can ask these questions and find out where these services might be located if they're asked about. But thank you for bringing that up, because that's such a good point about you know, our self-esteem, and that's part of it too, with that where is it on here? My functional piece. If I'm out there using a walker, what am I going to look like? We have one individual who's gone to some great lengths in order to not use her walker because she views that as a knock to her self-esteem. Okay. So I did want to read this and then encourage you to put in the chat box what are some clues that you see here. This is kind of our warm up to some of the vignettes that are coming in just a few minutes. Derek, at age 90, had been an active community member. In the past few years, though, his health has declined. He was even put on oxygen, which most of you know that means you have to carry something with you when you go out, which can be a struggle for some individuals, for most individuals who are on oxygen. It's been more than challenging for him to get out of his home, and he just really doesn't feel up to it. He doesn't feel up to the activities. And some of those activities were things like helping with the governance board in his neighborhood, going to a movie club, a book club, you know, things like that. When he does get out, which he doesn't typically get out to go with people someplace to do something fun. But when he does get out, people are noticing that he's unkempt and his clothes are hanging off of him. He hasn't been sleeping well, which you only know that because he asked the doctor for a pill to help him sleep, hoping that a pill would take care of it. He says he doesn't have anyone to depend upon, and he really hasn't been in touch with anyone other than the, you know, brief hello as he left to go to a doctor's appointment in the past month. So what are some of the risk factors that you can see here in this story? And this is based off of a real village member, although I did change some of it.
So Christine, you want people to put it in the chat. What are the risk factors that you see in this story for Derek?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Like I said, it's a warm up, so they're all right there. Yep, he's unkempt. He has no one to depend upon. And certainly with that, you know, there might be other village members who know him who would say, why, he has me. But again, we talked about the perception as well of loneliness. Yep, he's lost weight recently because his clothes are hanging out. Sounds like he might have depression. Those are some of the risk factors of isolation. Trying to understand why he's having difficulty sleeping. That would be a clue right there. Afraid of how he might look to others with that oxygen hanging off of him. Okay. And yeah, these are just things for you all to notice if you are out working with someone. And again, a lot of your work as a volunteer also depends upon what I've mentioned previously, is what are your boundaries? But I would be concerned if I was a volunteer and was asked to take this individual to a doctor's appointment. Again, these are risk factors of isolation, but it could be so much more. Someone mentioned depression, and I was going to bring that up as well. We went over most of these, but the lack of or interest in personal care. So someone no longer really keeping themselves up, loss of interest in things that they've done before, loss of pleasure with some of the items that, or some of the activities that used to give them pleasure, a deep boredom. And that was an interesting one as well. You would think, well, if you're bored, can't you find something to do? won't that make you feel better? But again, it's that whole piece of it, just not having the energy to get out, no longer getting that engagement that we get. And again, back to what I said, you know, I'm an introvert. I need my space. I do things like this, and I won't be talking to anybody else for the rest of the day. But even with that, I need people to connect with. So when a family member tells me, oh, they've always been a loner, sure, but we all also need to connect with other people on some level. That social withdrawal that he had, the poor eating, and the sleep disturbance. The other thing that, as a clinician, a lot of these things are the same things that I would be looking for depression. And again, I think as volunteers, these are things that you should be aware of. And I always say, go back to your organization if you're seeing this. You know, is this something that your organization can help him with? Does he need more resources? Does your village have other things that he might need? I'm looking through here just to make sure that I've answered all that. Yeah, I think we're going to, at the end of this, we're also going to talk about other topics. And I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of boundaries, although I've done that presentation as well. But I would certainly put that on the list as as one of the topics for discussion in the future. For now, what I would say is always go back to the executive director at your village, go back to the program manager at your faith-based organization. There's a comment, wouldn't it be cool if we could have an influencer who is an elder? Yes. I'm just reading this one to make sure that I understand it. It says, is the piece that the person has changed or that their personality is affecting them differently now and impeding their ability to accept help from volunteers? And I think what's going on here is that there have been some physical changes in the individual, which may be impacting their personality. They aren't able to accept help at the moment. But again, you know, the other piece is if they're asking for help or asking for a volunteer, you've cleared the first hurdle. The next hurdle is keeping them engaged so that they come back. And how do we keep those engagements that we have? And this is the other piece that Frank and I talked about. Some of the activities that a volunteer has to do with a village member or with a faith community member tend to be mundane. And I would argue that all of us have that, whether it's with our family members or with the neighbor we've taken care of. There's just a lot of day-to-day things that have to be taken care of, such as grocery shopping, such as getting to those appointments. So how do we make those more interesting so that we can really engage with them? And in fact, that's kind of the perfect bridge, but I'm going to stop briefly just to kind of give us a little bit of perspective on overcoming loneliness. When we are looking at the activities that overcome loneliness, we are really talking about developing that relationship. Again, you might only have that one moment to develop the relationship, but it is about the relationship. It is about engaging. Engagement is also getting the person involved, getting them excited about it. So it needs, the activities ideally are also have a piece to it that is theirs. We mentioned at the beginning that each individual is unique. What works for me might not work for you, might work for the person, this one person that you volunteer with, but somebody with almost the exact same situation over here, it just doesn't work for that person because of maybe their personality. So how do we get them involved? How do we get them interested or engaged? And how do we elicit the engagement and involvement in things that might be mundane? And we'll talk about that in just a moment. I'm checking the chat box here because we've had a couple of them. Yes, how do we keep them engaged? Well, we're going to see what we can do. And part of what is mentioned here is not just, it says, how do we keep volunteers engaged when the members can be both difficult, entitled, etc. And again, I think part of it is that perspective that we come from. Sometimes it lets me use the arrows and sometimes it doesn't let me use the arrows. So how do we create moments of joy in the mundane? And I had there were some that I wanted to bring up with people. Part of it is the preparation. Part of it is understanding what your intent is and anticipating your own reactions. So for example, and again, I mean intention in two different ways. What is my role in this engagement that I have, or this moment that I have with the older adult? And what do I want to get out of it? And that may be two different things. My job might be getting somebody to the grocery store, but what is my greater intention in that grocery store visit? What can I, where can I bring that joy in there? Anticipating our reactions. What if things go wrong? Is there a way to plan for this? What happens if suddenly they really seem to be really much more tired than I thought they would be? And here we are in the middle of the grocery store. What if they are angry and upset that day because they are in pain? Make sure that we're getting to know the person and that we're starting where they're at. That's always important. I'm a social worker by trade, and for us, we always start where they're at. So it might be that today it's really just about getting them to the doctor's office and not having them be really tired at the end of it. But that moment of understanding between myself and the older adult may turn into something more. And it might, again, I think Frank, you mentioned something about this is an acorn. That's how we often have to start, is this is the seed and where do I want that seed to go? Show them that you're interested, listen actively, be mindful. And when I say mindful, I think that runs through all of this. Again, we hear in mindfulness that we should set an intention for ourselves, that we really need to be present in that moment, which of course is listening actively, but it really is being engaged with them where they're at. And I think that's so important as we go through our day-to-day. But it's even more so in connecting and engaging with this individual who's in front of me. And have patience to the chat that was just up there. A lot of it is about having patience. Yes, people come to this and they're in pain and they're difficult. They feel like you're there for their benefit and there's no going the opposite way. So how do we change that? Can we be patient with it? Leave that space for fun. It's certainly, creating that moment of joy is not going to come if you're sitting there saying, come on, we got to move. Okay, we've got down this aisle, but we still got to get the milk and I got to go to another person. Oh, there's no room for this. And then just let go. Sometimes there's nothing else you can do. Well, thank you. Somebody said, I think this is point on, or the preparation is point on. So thank you. I'm glad I scored one there. So here's my next vignette. I know I'm running out of time here, so I'm speeding through some of this. What I want to do is read this to you and ask you to put in the chat box some of the ideas you have that could make this a meaningful engagement. Because remember, sometimes try as you might, it's just not going to end up with a positive tone. And other times you're just going to let go and you're going to think, wow, that was the best visit I've ever had. And I have no idea what happened. And it might be that you just left space for it. I need to make myself disappear or make Frank disappear so that I can read this. During COVID, volunteers were asked to make weekly phone calls to check on older members. There were concerns brought forth, which were reflected upon. Those that were administrative were addressed, but some of the concerns were personal in nature, primarily the discomfort of something different and frankly with the possibility to be mundane and repetitive. Anticipating this discomfort, each volunteer made a plan. Here was one. One volunteer added the time that she would call Sally into her calendar. She made sure it was a chunk of time. The volunteer considered what she wanted to get out of the call with Sally. Partially it was to, or mostly it was to ensure that Sally was okay, but she also thought about what seemed to be important to Sally: her family, her kids, her grandkids, her home, her memories. She looked for things that might be helpful to Sally. So for example, in the middle of COVID, you might remember Rare Medium was having some special meals. Of course, there are still programs online. I get emails constantly about what's out there. This volunteer was talking about some of those programs and which ones might be useful for Sally. Also about future items of need, and just made a little note to mention them. Made sure Sally would know she was thinking about her. At the appointed time, the volunteer chose a quiet place to sit without distractions, whether it was outside or in a separate room. We all have become really good about multitasking. Upon calling, the volunteer opened up the conversation with open-ended questions, just letting Sally kind of lead it, listening to her responses and using a mindful curiosity and asking follow-up questions. During the course of the conversation, the volunteer shared the information she had to provide and answered Sally's questions, including the ones that were personal, but keeping in mind boundaries. Sometimes the conversations only lasted a few minutes, though most of the time they lasted for the full 20 or 30 minutes set aside. So if you could put, actually, you know what, if you want to put some items into the chat, we are just about out of time. But I'm also going to go ahead and go through and just see if you were able to catch on some of them. So the self-reflection and anticipating, this is where I was talking about the anticipating. So this volunteer, or some of the concerns that came up with making these phone calls, were that it was going to be mundane or it was going to be repetitive. Some people expressed a difficulty in making phone calls. They preferred doing the friendly visits, but this was a switch that we had to go in person. The preparation, setting aside the time and putting it in the calendar, especially if it is a difficult person that you're volunteering with. Sometimes it can be, oh, I don't really want to take them grocery shopping, or, oh, okay, well, I want to do this. So setting aside the time. And again, in this case, it was about the phone calls, and some of that was difficult just to even find the time. Sometimes even something like a simple phone call just gets completely lost. Keeping an eye on the prize for connection. So this volunteer recognized that it wasn't just about the phone call, it was more about the long-term goal of being in touch with someone else, connecting with someone else. And that active listening, really hearing what they have to say instead of thinking about the next 5 things that you need to talk with them about. That's why you have your little checklist, so that if there is time, you can share that. And being curious and present while talking. And in the chat box here, it says, each time you ask an older adult with questions to spur the discussion and good listening to ask for more details as the discussion ensues is a win. Being interested in their life makes them visible. Exactly. It shows them that you're seeing them. And that's another thing there, jotting down different items. It makes sure that people recognize that you were thinking about them. And I know that each village is different. Again, this is kind of depends upon if you're volunteering with a village or a faith group. I know some of the villages, they want you to volunteer with the same person over and over again, and others say first come, first served, and just assign it. So it does also depend upon what your program does. Okay. Yes, and exactly. Helping them during this one time really, even if you can reduce those feelings of isolation um, during this one event. And certainly if you end up learning from them, that's so much more bonus. And I think sharing that sometimes can be helpful. It helps build that self-esteem as well. One of the issues with older adults is they've had such a rewarding life. They've been, maybe parents, maybe they've been top executives, and then there's retirement. And some people do really well at retirement, and other people don't have as much of a plan, or maybe this chronic illness hit. So also helping build them up in that way. Frank, I know we're just about out of time here. Do you want me to do the other vignette?
I really, maybe since we started a little bit late, if you have time, Christine, we could do the other vignette and open it up. If people need to leave, we certainly understand that. And then if anyone has ideas for future training topics, I'd really like you to put those in the chat so I can see those. But if you have just a few more minutes, Christine, to go through the next one.
Yep, I do. Okay. Okay, so same type. Put your ideas in the chat box, but this one's particularly on grocery shopping. One of our volunteer frequently takes Barbara to the grocery store. Barbara no longer drives and also has some difficulty walking. She has a caregiver, but she prefers to go with the volunteer. The volunteer sets aside an appropriate chunk of time to accompany her and plans out where they need to go ahead of time, considering Barbara's needs and challenges. So, where are the cutouts? Does this grocery store have a scooter? All of that type of thing. Barbara is usually eager to get going. This is her fun outing. So in this particular case, the older adult automatically thinks it's fun. So we can build on that. And she's in charge, which stores, what items, etc. The volunteer, and again, she goes to the same ones pretty much every time. So the volunteer, the first time, had to be prepared for what she couldn't prepare for. But now she's able to really know, okay, this is where I need to park. This is how it works. The volunteer has observed how this trip gets Barbara moving and active, because otherwise she's mostly in her apartment in front of the TV, unfortunately. And if Barbara is having a tough day physically and would rather use the motorized scooter, or needed to be encouraged to use the scooter that the store provides, well, who hasn't wanted to take a set of wheels down a forbidden hallway or aisle? And when the volunteer was telling me about this, she was chuckling as she recollected the first time she and Barbara chose to use the scooter. And it was certainly a learning experience. She said, "You better watch out for Barbara when she's in that scooter." And it's obviously now become a shared joke. If there is time when they are done shopping, they might sit outside on the bench and talk to the neighbors after unloading the groceries, or just spend time reflecting on previous summer days or discussing how beautiful the colors are in the spring and fall. As mentioned, Barbara has a caregiver, but the caregiver helps her and is there at her children's insistence. In her mind, she doesn't need the help. Grocery store trips with the volunteer gives her a slice of independence and doesn't remind her of what she feels she has lost. And we certainly have other older adults who believe that or who love to cook. So this is their fabulous time, or recollections of, for example, during Thanksgiving, a grocery trip turned into memory lane about Thanksgiving. And again, it's just being aware of everything. Let's see, just wanted to make sure there wasn't anything in the chat box. So getting to know the person. again, what's important to them, talking about that grocery store. You're right. Someone just posted that this volunteer is actually more than a volunteer. They've become friends over time. And I do think there is a level of friendship that has developed. Again, you'll hear me say it again and again. There are boundaries, though, that have come in, because you can certainly be friendly and remain a volunteer. Connections within connections. So understanding that the important piece is to have this individual have more contacts, have more people she knows, and she loves her neighbors, but because she doesn't get out so often, she doesn't have the opportunity. So here the volunteer who's put in a little bit of extra time has created an opportunity to bond with the neighbors. And if there's no one outside, or nobody happens to walk outside when they're out there, the other piece that the volunteers all reminded me of, especially with the beautiful colors that are outside right now, are those colors, are the sensory pieces, the sounds of fall. And again, I'm talking about fall because there's this brilliant red tree, although right now it's getting dark outside of my window. So it's important to notice those things. And if we're not mindful, we might not notice them. Again, knowing our boundaries. I have to admit with this, the volunteer has had to say, I cannot take you unless you use your walker. I can run to the grocery store for you if you don't want to use your walker. So again, going back to what is my role? What can I do? I'm not, as a volunteer, you're not a certified nursing assistant. You're not a caregiver. Gotta find, there it is. Again, respecting this woman, Barbara, treating her with dignity, giving her that moment of independence, and understanding what she needs. You know, to us, this is a grocery store. It's a list on our, it's a to-do on our list. I usually have to squeeze it in. But for her, it really is about that independence. I get to pick what I'm taking home. Now, we might have a whole other conversation on whether or not you should be helping them buy tons of sugar and alcohol and all of that. But that's for a different conversation. And I see there are some great example of how the volunteer offers a new person, new perspectives for the older adult and a sense of their own network outside of the family. Yep, very much so. And yes, so different. I can't say it enough how important volunteers are. You aren't paid individuals, and that's also a really important piece. There's something special that you have to offer. And then we do have some comments about future topics. Yep, incontinence. I think that's one of the things that we've all been in these circumstances, and that's why it's really important to anticipate what your reactions are going to be to individuals and the possibilities of things that can come up. And again, it might be something really simple. One of the things that we've talked about in ageism before is just assuming that people can't hear, for example, that came up earlier. I have a very soft voice, and I know I have a soft voice. So when I talk to an older adult, I talk in my presenting voice. But I have been yelled at before because someone has said to me, "You don't have to yell at me. I can hear you just fine." But she immediately understood when I dropped out of my presenting voice and said, okay, get that up a little bit more. So we had a good laugh over that, but anticipating what's coming. So again, I just wanted to kind of reiterate, really leave time for the laughter and the joy. Leave time to be playful. Who wouldn't have fun going on a scooter around the store? I've never ridden one, but I've always wanted to. um, okay. Any other questions? I see there are some comments about future topics.
That- That's great. Christine, I just want to give one quick example of a way to anticipate an issue and set a boundary, and also maybe make the person feel a little special. So, there's somebody who calls me frequently and likes to talk for a very long time. And I now say to this person, "Oh, great. I'm so glad that you called. You called me during the 10 minutes that I have available. And I'm so glad to hear from you during this time." And so I've set the boundary, and this person then feels pretty special.
Mhm.
But and we'll often set a timer for our phone calls. Um, so
Nice.
so it seems to work. It's still a way to be playful, but it didn't come to me the first time when I spent an hour and a half, or the second time, or the third time. It came to me the fourth time, where I had to figure out, okay, when this happens, how can I set some boundaries but still make this person feel like I want to talk to them, which I do, just within a certain amount of time frame.
Right. And I'm glad that you said that, because I also feel like we do have to let go and see try different things, because this might work this time, but not next time. But it would be great also to, as you mentioned, this would be so different if we were in person. We could have so much more learning from one another, which I typically really like to hear. That's why I was reading off the chat, because I feel like we do learn so much from each other.
Maybe we could just take one question and then we can wrap up. Alan's asking, what if you really don't have anything in common with the person? How do you make that work?
I do, I think that that is a difficult thing. But I think understanding what the circumstance is, and being mindful to the opportunities that come up, and finding a common ground. For example, as I mentioned with, the grocery shopping, we've all had Thanksgiving dinners that have gone horrible. We've all had Thanksgiving dinners that we've loved. So while you might not have anything to engage with them, like you don't read the same books, you don't like the same movies, you can find a commonality in your humanity. Do you both have families? Do you both have loved ones? um, Look for that common ground. That's anything to add to that, Frank, while I have you on the screen here?
I can tell you, asking questions,
Hmm.
trying to find out more about them, leaving it open-ended, as I think you said before, asking some of those open-ended questions, um, and reverting to the weather, or
Yep.
some of those common things, or the color of the trees, or what's it look like outside of your window? Do you have a good view? Even some of those questions that are very short and may only have a few minutes of conversation that ensue, because I still think shows the other person that you care and you're making that phone call. So you may not get a ton back, Alan, but it may be a kernel.
That reminded me that, one of the reasons why I put the Connect to Effect up there is, that's the AARP version of kind of the UK's campaign to end loneliness. And one of the things that they have on there are conversation starters, which are a good thing. They actually have it as, I'm the older adult who's isolated, but I think you as a volunteer can kind of look at those. Or I have a set of cards. I actually use it with my kids for like, conversation starters in the car. And you can find them about everything. Just have a few of those in your back pocket. Yeah, asking questions. Thank you.
That's great. And I want to thank you, Christine, very much for your great presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm terribly sorry about the technical difficulties beginning. So please forgive us. but this is being recorded, so we'll disseminate this widely. I'll also be reviewing the chat to make sure that we take into consideration your ideas for future training. And we'll be taking some of these key points, including that last thing that Christine said, the resource on conversation starters, and those will go into our volunteer newsletter and tips. So this won't end here, but it's the beginning. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you have a
Thank
great
you.
Sunday evening. Take care now.